The clay tablets don't describe a battle or an invasion. They describe something far more unsettling: withdrawal. Around 2200 BCE, Sumerian scribes began recording a phrase that appears again and again across multiple texts. The gods have abandoned their dwellings. Temple archives document rituals performed to deities who no longer responded, offerings made to statues that stood silent and empty, prayers sent into a void where divine presence once resided. Within a century, the greatest cities of Mesopotamia lay abandoned, their populations scattered, their irrigation systems falling into ruin, and their priests asking a question that still echoes across 4,200 years: why did the Anunnaki let it all collapse? Welcome. It's late, I know, and perhaps you've come here seeking not just sleep, but also understanding, some way to make sense of how great things fall apart. Thank you for being here tonight. What we're about to explore together touches on one of the most profound mysteries in ancient history, where archaeological evidence, climate science, theological texts converge on a single catastrophic century when Sumerian civilization experienced systemic collapse, and the divine beings who supposedly founded it apparently chose not to intervene. Here's what makes this remarkable. The texts don't describe the gods being defeated or destroyed. They describe voluntary departure, deliberate abandonment, a conscious decision by the Anunnaki to withdraw their protection and let human civilization face consequences the gods themselves may have orchestrated. Mainstream archaeologists and historians see this as mythology encoding environmental catastrophe, severe drought documented in sediment cores, political instability following the Akkadian Empire's overreach, and invasion by peoples from the Zagros Mountains who swept down onto the Mesopotamian plain. The divine abandonment narrative, in this view, represents how traumatized survivors made sense of systemic collapse, projecting their experience of losing everything onto theological frameworks that positioned gods as the ultimate authority. But there's another reading, one that takes the text more literally. Some researchers point to the specificity of the abandonment descriptions, the careful documentation of which gods left which cities and in what order, the precise rituals attempted to call them back, and ask whether ancient scribes might have been recording actual events. Their conceptual vocabulary forced them to describe in religious language. Whether you interpret this as gods, as extraterrestrial beings departing Earth, as a collapse of some form of contact or technology, or as sophisticated mythology processing trauma, the texts themselves remain powerful and strange. We're not here to settle that debate tonight. Our purpose isn't to prove the Anunnaki were real or unreal, present or absent, alien visitors or theological constructs. We're here to explore what the texts actually say about collapse, abandonment, and the ending of ages. We're here to examine how one of humanity's first civilizations understood catastrophe and recorded their understanding in words that survived when their cities did not. Take a breath. Where are you right now? Maybe in bed with darkness around you, or perhaps in a chair with just enough light to feel safe but not disturbed. Let your shoulders drop slightly. There's nowhere else you need to be, nothing you need to solve tonight. We're simply going to listen to what ancient voices recorded about the end of their world. If this exploration speaks to you, a like or subscribe helps others find these journeys into deep time and forgotten catastrophes. It's a small gesture that matters more than you might think. Thank you. Now then, picture southern Mesopotamia around 2300 BCE, before the collapse, when the early dynastic period was giving way to the Akkadian Empire. Cities stretched across the alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates, their temple complexes rising above irrigated fields that produced enough surplus to support tens of thousands of people who didn't farm: priests, scribes, craftsmen, soldiers, administrators. The gods resided in their temples, literally present in statue form, fed daily, clothed seasonally, consulted through divination and dreams. This wasn't metaphor to them. The gods were there, protecting their cities, ensuring prosperity, maintaining cosmic order through their physical presence. And then, within a single century, that presence withdrew, those protections failed, and the world they'd built collapsed into chaos that would take generations to recover from. The tablets that describe this collapse still exist, baked hard by ancient fires or simply dried in the desert sun, their wedge-shaped marks as clear today as when styluses pressed them into wet clay during the darkest period of Mesopotamian history. What they say about divine abandonment, about why the gods let it happen, and about what occurred when protection was removed, that's what we're here to explore, moving slowly through the evidence, the theories, and the enduring mystery of why civilizations fall, and whether the forces that build them sometimes choose to let them crumble. Stand in Uruk around 2500 BCE, on a morning when the city has just awakened to the calls of vendors in the marketplace. the bleating of goats being driven to temple courtyards for sacrifice, and the rhythmic sound of looms clicking in workshops where weavers produce textiles that will travel hundreds of kilometers along trade routes stretching to the Indus Valley. The air carries the scent of baking bread, mixed with the ever-present smell of the river, that distinctive odor of silt and water and fish that defines life in southern Mesopotamia. This is Sumer at its peak, the early dynastic third period, when perhaps 50,000 people live within Uruk's walls, and its temple complex dedicated to Inanna sprawls across nearly 10 hectares of prime urban real estate. The world they inhabited functioned under divine protection. Each major city had its patron deity, who literally resided there in statue form, housed in temples maintained by hundreds of priests, administrators, and workers. Nippur belonged to Enlil, storm god and king of gods. Ura belonged to the moon god Nanna. Eridu remained the sacred city of Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water. Lagash served the warrior god Ningirsu. This wasn't abstract theology but practical reality. The gods protected their cities, ensured agricultural success, granted victory in warfare, and maintained cosmic order through their physical presence. Agricultural surplus made everything else possible. The alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates produced extraordinary yields when properly irrigated, with barley harvests reaching 30-fold returns under optimal conditions, far exceeding what rain-fed agriculture could achieve elsewhere. Canal systems extending for kilometers distributed water from the rivers to fields that stretched beyond sight, creating a landscape of geometric precision where human engineering imposed order on the natural flood cycles. Archaeologists estimate that southern Mesopotamia during this period supported population densities approaching 50 people per square kilometer in agricultural zones, remarkable for a pre-industrial society. Trade networks connected Sumer to distant regions. Copper came from Oman, tin from Afghanistan, or perhaps Iran, lapis lazuli from the mountains east of the Indus, carnelian from the Indian subcontinent, cedarwood, essential for monumental architecture since Mesopotamia possessed no native timber, arrived from Lebanon after long overland journeys. These weren't occasional exchanges but systematic trade requiring organization, record-keeping, and diplomatic relationships that archaeological evidence reveals existed across thousands of kilometers. Seals from the Indus Valley have been found in Mesopotamian cities, and Mesopotamian artifacts appear in sites throughout the Persian Gulf. Writing had achieved sophisticated expression by this period. The cuneiform script, which began around 3200 BCE as simple accounting marks, now captured complex narratives, legal codes, royal inscriptions, hymns to gods, and administrative documents of remarkable detail. Temple archives preserved thousands of tablets documenting every aspect of institutional life, from the amount of barley issued to workers to the specific offerings made to divine statues on festival days. This bureaucratic record-keeping would later allow us to trace the collapse with precision, seeing exactly when certain economic activities ceased, when trade goods stopped arriving, when population declined. The cities themselves embodied permanence. Mud brick architecture, constantly rebuilt and expanded, created artificial mounds that rose meters above the surrounding plain through centuries of accumulated occupation. Defensive walls, some reaching 10 meters in height and thick enough that 2 chariots could pass on top, protected against raids from nomadic peoples or rival city-states. The ziggurat at Ur, though built slightly later, represents this impulse toward monumental architecture, a mounting constructed from approximately 720,000 baked bricks, expressing in physical form the connection between earth and heaven that the gods supposedly maintained. Perhaps 200,000 people lived in southern Mesopotamia during this peak period, spread across dozens of cities and countless agricultural villages. They assumed this would continue indefinitely. Why wouldn't it? The gods had always protected them, the rivers had always flowed, the harvests had always come. Previous difficulties had been overcome through proper ritual, increased offerings, and appeals to divine mercy. The cosmic order seemed stable, tested by time, guaranteed by divine presence. But cosmic order requires maintenance. The relationship between gods and humans, as the texts carefully explain, was transactional. Humans provided service, offerings, worship, and the gods provided protection, fertility, victory. This wasn't love or grace but contract, and contracts can be broken by either party. When humans failed in their obligations or somehow offended divine sensibilities, the gods possessed the right to withdraw their protection, and if the gods chose to leave, if they decided humanity no longer deserved their presence, or that cosmic cycles required a reset, nothing humans could do would prevent the catastrophe that followed. The stars wheeled overhead unchanged, marking seasons and years through their predictable movements. Venus rising as morning and evening star in patterns priests had tracked for generations. Those stars had witnessed the rise of Sumerian civilization from scattered villages to great cities, and they would witness what came next: the sudden withdrawal of divine favor, the collapse of the most sophisticated society Earth had yet produced, and the desperate attempts by survivors to understand why their world had ended, while the gods watched in apparent silence from whatever heights they'd retreated to, leaving their earthly dwellings empty and their people abandoned to forces they could no longer control. The relationship began with a promise. According to Sumerian theology, gods created humans specifically to serve them, to bear the burden of maintaining creation that lesser divine beings, the Igigi, had refused through rebellion. This origin story, preserved in texts like the Atrahasis epic, establishes humanity's purpose as fundamentally service-oriented. We exist to feed the gods through sacrifice, to maintain their temples, to provide worship that sustains divine power. In exchange, the gods offer protection, prosperity, and continued existence. Break the contract, and the gods withdraw their favor. Maintain it properly, and civilization continues. Temple architecture embodied this covenant in physical form. The innermost sanctuary of every major temple contained a statue of the patron deity, typically crafted from precious materials including gold, silver, and lapis lazuli, standing approximately 1 to 1.5 meters tall. This wasn't symbolic representation but actual presence. The god dwelt in the statue, inhabited it, operated through it. Daily rituals treated the statue as a living being requiring food, clothing, bathing, and entertainment. Morning ceremonies followed precise sequences that priests performed for centuries with minimal variation. Temple attendants woke the god at dawn, opening the sanctuary doors to allow light to enter the sacred chamber. They brought water for washing, fresh garments for dressing, and elaborate meals featuring bread, beer, meat, fruit, and other offerings that represented the agricultural surplus the community produced. Musicians played, singers chanted hymns, and incense burned constantly, creating sensory experiences designed to please divine senses. Archaeological excavations of temple complexes reveal the scale of these operations. The Temple of Bao at Lagash during the early dynastic Third period employed approximately 1,200 people in various capacities, owned roughly 10,000 hectares of agricultural land, maintained herds numbering in the thousands, and distributed monthly rations totaling hundreds of thousands of liters of barley and oil. This single institution functioned as the largest economic entity in its region, controlling more resources than any individual ruler or extended family network. Consider what this means about the divine-human relationship. The gods depended on human labor to maintain their earthly residences, to produce the offerings that fed them, to perform the rituals that sustained cosmic order. Humans depended on divine protection to ensure harvests, prevent disease, grant military victory, and maintain the natural cycles that made agriculture possible. This mutual dependence created genuine partnership, though hardly one of equals, more like the relationship between a powerful lord and subordinate vassals, bound by reciprocal obligations. Divination practices reveal how seriously this relationship was taken. Before any major undertaking, whether military campaign, temple construction, or political decision, rulers consulted the gods through various methods including examining sheep livers, interpreting oil patterns on water, or recording dreams. Thousands of omen texts survive, documenting the observations and interpretations that guided decision-making across centuries. A favorable omen meant the gods approved, granting permission to proceed. An unfavorable omen required postponement, additional offerings, or abandonment of the planned action. What happened when the gods stopped responding? The texts hint at this anxiety, even during prosperous periods, describing rituals designed to prevent divine anger or abandonment. Prayer laments occasionally mention gods turning their faces away or becoming distant, suggesting awareness that the relationship could deteriorate. Priests developed elaborate protocols for repairing damaged relationships, including substitute king rituals, where a commoner temporarily assumed royal identity to absorb divine punishment, meant for the actual ruler. The covenant assumed stability. Humans would continue serving, gods would continue protecting, and the cosmic machinery would operate indefinitely through this reciprocal arrangement. But covenants require both parties to maintain their commitments, and the texts that describe the collapse repeatedly emphasize that this fundamental relationship broke down. Whether the gods chose to leave because humans failed their obligations, because cosmic cycles required periodic reset, or because some other factor disrupted the compact, the result was catastrophic. Protection withdrawn, presence departed, temples empty. Imagine being a priest in one of these temples around 2200 BCE, when the omens turn consistently negative, when divination produces only warnings and threats, when rituals performed correctly for generations suddenly seem to yield no response from the deity you've served your entire life. You continue the daily offerings, the hymns, the incense, the careful maintenance of every detail that tradition demands. But something has changed. The statue stands silent, the god doesn't answer, and beyond the temple walls, crops begin failing, enemies press closer, and people whisper that divine favor has been withdrawn. The breakdown of this compact would transform not just Mesopotamian civilization, but humanity's understanding of the divine-human relationship. After the collapse, theological texts increasingly emphasize divine transcendence rather than immanence, positioning gods in distant heavens rather than earthly dwellings. The confident assumption that gods lived among humans, protecting and guiding them through direct presence, gave way to more anxious theology that treated divine contact as rare and uncertain. Something broke during the collapse that could never be fully repaired, some trust or expectation that survivors and their descendants would carry as trauma memory for generations. The stars continued their movements, indifferent to human suffering or divine politics, marking time according to patterns established long before gods supposedly descended to Mesopotamia, and would continue long after the last temple fell silent, and the last priest made offerings to statues that no longer housed divine presence, if they ever had. The signs appeared gradually, building over decades before the catastrophic collapse around 2200 BCE. Omen text from the late Akkadian period, roughly 2250 to 2200 BCE, show increasing frequency of negative divinations, lunar eclipses, interpreted as threatening the king's life, unusual star positions suggesting divine anger, failed harvests attributed to the gods withholding rain. Priests recorded these observations meticulously, creating an archive of anxiety that documents the psychological shift from confidence to crisis. Naram-Sin ruled the Akkadian Empire from approximately 2254 to 2218 BCE, and the texts that mention him paint a portrait of hubris. He claimed divinity during his lifetime, unprecedented for Mesopotamian rulers, having his name written with the divine determinative sign typically reserved for gods. Statues show him wearing the horned crown that marked divine status. This self-deification probably reflected military success. He expanded the empire to its maximum extent, campaigning as far as the Zagros Mountains and perhaps into Anatolia. But success bred arrogance, and arrogance, according to the theological narratives composed after the collapse, invited divine retribution. The Curse of Akkad text, composed around 2100 BCE, about events from a century earlier, describes Naram-Sin's fatal mistake. He attacks Enlil's temple, the Ekor at Nippur, the most sacred site in Mesopotamia, cosmic center where heaven and earth supposedly met. The text specifies that he brought the pickaxe against the temple's foundation, disturbing its sacred structure. Whether this actually happened remains debated. No archaeological evidence confirms the Ekor's destruction during this period, but the text treats the sacrilege as historical fact, the defining event that triggered divine abandonment. Enlil's response, according to the narrative, was measured and terrible. He didn't strike Naram-Sin down immediately, but instead summoned a people from the mountains, the Gutians, described in Sumerian texts as barely human barbarians who know no inhibitions, with human instincts, but canine intelligence and monkey features. This dehumanizing description probably reflects Sumerian ethnic prejudice more than accurate anthropology, but it captures how the invasion was perceived as divine punishment executed through forces of chaos. Archaeological evidence supports the general picture of increasing instability. Tel Leilan in northern Syria, a major city during this period, shows sudden abandonment around 2200 BCE, with occupation layers revealing no gradual decline but abrupt desertion. The site remained largely unoccupied for approximately 300 years. Similar patterns appear across northern Mesopotamia, with settlement surveys showing dramatic reduction in site numbers and occupied area during the late 3rd millennium BCE. Climate data extracted from ocean sediment cores and cave formations reveals severe drought conditions beginning around 2200 BCE and lasting for centuries. This wasn't a single bad year, but systemic environmental stress, with rainfall possibly declining by 30 to 40% compared to earlier periods. For agricultural societies dependent on predictable water supplies, this represented existential threat. The drought-affected regions far beyond Mesopotamia, Egypt's Old Kingdom, collapsed during the same period, as did the Indus Valley civilization, suggesting a widespread climate event that destabilized civilizations across a vast area. Did the gods control weather? To ancient Mesopotamians, absolutely. Enlil was the storm god who brought both life-giving rain and destructive floods. Drought meant Enlil had withdrawn his blessing. perhaps as punishment for human transgressions. Modern science identifies the cause as natural climate variability, possibly related to volcanic eruptions or shifts in atmospheric circulation patterns. But the experience was identical. The rains stopped coming, crops failed repeatedly, and people starved while their gods apparently did nothing to help. Defensive architecture tells its own story. Cities that had managed for centuries with relatively modest fortifications suddenly began constructing massive new walls in the decades before 2200 BCE. All's wall was rebuilt and reinforced. Smaller cities that had operated without significant defenses erected barriers for the first time. This pattern suggests increasing military threat, either from external invaders or internal conflict, as resources became scarce and city-states fought over diminishing agricultural surplus. Perhaps the most telling evidence comes from changes in settlement patterns. Populations appear to have abandoned smaller villages and concentrated in larger fortified cities, a strategic response to insecurity. But this concentration strained food supplies and sanitation systems, potentially contributing to disease outbreaks that further weakened the society. The archaeological signature shows simultaneous processes of aggregation and collapse, people gathering together for protection, even as the system supporting them disintegrated. The texts describe attempts to prevent disaster through increased religious activity. Naram Sin's successors reportedly offered extraordinary sacrifices, rebuilt damaged temples, and performed elaborate rituals designed to regain divine favor. Shah Kali Shari, who ruled the Akkadian Empire from approximately 2217 to 2193 BCE, left inscriptions describing his pious restoration of temples and proper performance of rituals. But the collapse continued despite his efforts, suggesting either that divine anger was implacable or that the underlying causes, drought, political instability, economic stress, couldn't be resolved through ritual means. Looking backward from our position 4,200 years later, we can see the convergence of environmental stress, political overreach, and probably pure bad luck that created the crisis. But for those living through it, the explanation seemed obvious. The gods were withdrawing their protection, abandoning their cities, and humanity faced consequences for failures real or imagined. The warnings had been given through omens, through crop failures, through increasing violence, and soon within a single generation, the entire edifice of Sumerian civilization would collapse as divine protection was fully withdrawn, and the forces of chaos swept across the Mesopotamian plain, leaving ruins and questions that still haven't been fully answered. The tablet begins with a lament, its opening lines describing Akkad as it was before divine anger descended. Once upon a time, Akkad was exalted. Its princess was the divine Inanna. The sanctuary Inanna was its citadel. The text, composed around 2100 BCE, roughly a century after the events it describes, serves as both historical record and theological explanation for why the Akkadian Empire collapsed so completely that its capital city Akkad has never been definitively located, despite more than 150 years of archaeological searching. The Curse of Akkad represents one of Mesopotamia's most important collapse narratives, a 280-line composition that survives in multiple copies from different periods, indicating it was copied and studied for at least 1,000 years after its composition. The text doesn't treat the fall of Akkad as accident or misfortune, but as deliberate divine retribution for sacrilege, making it essential evidence for understanding how ancient Mesopotamians interpreted catastrophic societal breakdown. Naram Sin appears as the tragic protagonist. The text describes him as initially pious, maintaining proper relationships with the gods, ensuring temple offerings continued, and governing according to divine mandate. Under his rule, Akkad flourished beyond previous measure, with tribute flowing from conquered territories and the city becoming wealthy beyond imagination. The text specifies that foreign lands brought exotic goods, elephants, water buffalo, and beasts of faraway mountains and countries, creating an image of prosperity and cosmopolitan sophistication. But something shifts in Naram Sin's heart. According to the narrative, he becomes troubled by dreams, or perhaps by divine silence, when he seeks guidance through divination. The text describes him making offerings at Enlil's temple in Nippur, the Akur, but receiving no response, no favourable omens, no signs that the gods approved his actions. Frustrated by this silence, Naram Sin makes a fatal decision. If the gods won't respond, he'll force a response by violating the most sacred site in Mesopotamia. The assault on the Akur gets described with horrific detail. Naram Sin mobilized his army, brought great axes against the temple's foundation, and cast down the temple with the pickaxe. He ordered his soldiers to destroy the sacred structure, to break into the inner chambers where only authorized priests could enter, to profane what should remain inviolate. The text emphasizes the cosmic significance of this act. by describing how the Earth itself responded. The Earth trembled, natural order disrupted by human sacrilege against divine architecture. Enlil's response comes swiftly but not directly. Rather than striking Naram-Sin down immediately, Enlil convenes a divine council, and together the great gods make a terrible decision. They vote to destroy Akkad completely, to curse its very ground so that it will never rise again. The mechanism of destruction comes from the mountains. Enlil summons the Gutians, described as speaking no proper language, understanding no civilization, existing somewhere between human and animal. These are the instruments through which divine judgment will operate. The text then describes the abandonment of the gods in systematic detail. 8 major deities are named individually as departing their earthly dwellings. Inanna abandons her temple at Akkad. Nanna leaves Ur. Ninurta departs Nippur. Enki withdraws from Eridu. Each departure is mourned, creating a litany of loss that shows the scope of divine rejection. This wasn't one god angry with one city, but the entire divine assembly choosing to leave humanity to face consequences without protection. What follows reads like apocalypse. The Gutians descend from the mountains like locusts, destroying everything in their path. Agriculture ceases as fields lie untended or are deliberately destroyed. Trade routes close as merchants fear to travel. Cities empty as populations flee or starve. The text describes mothers unable to feed children, the elderly dying unburied, temples falling into ruin, and cosmic order collapsing into chaos. Archaeological evidence for Akkad's destruction remains frustratingly elusive, because we still haven't found Akkad itself with certainty. Several sites have been proposed as candidates, including Tel Muhammad, near modern Baghdad, but none conclusively identified. This absence creates strange irony. The capital of the empire that unified Mesopotamia for the first time has vanished so completely that even its location remains disputed, perhaps fulfilling the curse that it should never be found or rebuilt. But whether the Ekur was actually destroyed by Naram-Sin remains uncertain. Excavations at Nippur show continuous occupation through this period, with no destruction layer dating to the reign of Naram-Sin. The temple complex shows rebuilding and renovation across centuries, but nothing suggesting the catastrophic assault the text describes. This raises uncomfortable questions about the text's historical reliability versus its function as theological literature, explaining collapse through narrative framework that made sense within Sumerian cosmology. Perhaps the physical destruction of the Ekur never happened, and the curse of Akkad represents later scribes creating explanatory mythology for events they knew occurred, but whose causes they couldn't fully understand. Or perhaps the assault was real but modest enough that archaeological traces dissolved over time, with later tradition amplifying a limited profanation into wholesale destruction. The text might preserve distorted memory of actual sacrilege, or it might invent sacrilege to explain collapse that had purely material causes. What remains certain is that this text established a template for understanding catastrophe that would influence Mesopotamian thought for millennia. When cities fall, when empires collapse, when divine protection seems withdrawn, the explanation lies in human failure to maintain proper relationships with the gods. The stars wheel overhead unchanged, marking time according to patterns established before humans or gods supposedly walked the earth, witnessing the rise and fall of civilizations with the same indifference they show to all terrestrial drama. Settlement surveys conducted across northern and southern Mesopotamia during the late 20th century reveal the scale of collapse around 2200 BCE with startling clarity. Sites occupied for centuries show sudden abandonment, with ceramic sequences breaking off, building foundations left incomplete, and occupation layers ending abruptly without gradual decline. In the Diyala region northeast of Baghdad, the number of occupied sites drops from 94 during the Akkadian period to just 38 during the subsequent post-Akkadian period, representing a 60% reduction in settled locations. Tel Leilan in northeastern Syria provides the most dramatic example. This city, covering approximately 90 hectares at its peak, served as a major administrative center during the Akkadian Empire, controlling trade routes and agricultural production across a wide region. Excavations revealed substantial architecture, included administrative buildings, residential areas, and defensive walls reaching 5 meters in thickness. But around 2200 BCE, something happened that emptied the city almost overnight. Harvey Weiss led excavations at Tel Leilan beginning in 1978, working through multiple seasons to understand the site's complex occupational history. His team reached levels dating to the late Akkadian period and found something unexpected in 1993. The abandonment layer appeared as sterile sediment approximately 30 centimeters thick, accumulated wind-blown dust containing no artifacts, no pottery shards, no evidence of human presence. Beneath this layer lay the final occupation phase, with buildings intact, storage jars still in place, and material culture suggesting normal life suddenly interrupted. Above the sterile layer, occupation resumed around 1900 BCE, with different pottery styles indicating new populations. The gap represented roughly 300 years of abandonment. Weiss's team collected sediment samples for analysis, examining them under microscope and conducting chemical tests to determine their composition and origin. The results showed volcanic ash particles mixed with local dust, suggesting atmospheric disruption from distant eruptions combined with severe regional drought. Soil samples from ancient agricultural fields around Tel Leilan revealed dramatic changes in pollen composition, with cultivated species disappearing and drought-resistant wild plants increasing. The environmental evidence supported what the archaeology showed. The region became uninhabitable, not through military destruction, but through environmental collapse. The discovery transformed understanding of the late 3rd millennium BCE collapse. Previous theories emphasized political factors, military invasions, or social dysfunction as primary causes. The Tel Leilan evidence demonstrated that environmental catastrophe played a crucial and perhaps determinative role, creating conditions where even sophisticated urban centers couldn't sustain themselves, regardless of military strength or administrative capability. Similar patterns emerge at sites across the Near East. Brak in Syria shows abandonment around 2200 BCE. Tel Mozan experienced massive depopulation. Southern Mesopotamian cities, including Umma and Girsu, show reduced occupation and economic activity. The synchronicity suggests system-wide collapse triggered by environmental stress affecting the entire region simultaneously, not just local conflicts or isolated disasters. Defensive architecture from this period tells stories of desperation. Cities that had operated for centuries with modest walls suddenly constructed massive new fortifications. At Kafaja in the Diyala region, a defensive wall approximately 8 meters thick was built during the late Akkadian period, far exceeding anything the city had previously required. Similar overbuilding appears at multiple sites, suggesting populations anticipated attack and invested scarce resources in protection that ultimately proved insufficient. The pottery record reveals social disruption through changing styles and techniques. Akkadian period ceramics show standardization across wide areas, suggesting centralized production and distribution networks. Post-collapse pottery becomes more localized and variable, indicating breakdown of long-distance trade and economic integration. Quality decreases as well, with later examples showing cruder manufacture and simpler decoration compared to Akkadian predecessors. Destruction layers at some sites show evidence of violence. Tel Asmar has burning and collapsed walls dating to this period. Mari on the Euphrates shows destruction around 2200 BCE, with rebuilding in subsequent years using different architectural styles. But violence appears as symptom rather than primary cause. Populations weakened by environmental stress became vulnerable to raiders, invaders, or internal conflict that they might have withstood under better conditions. What's striking is what the archaeological record doesn't show. There's no evidence of massive population die-off through disease or famine, in the way that later plagues left skeletal remains in mass graves. Populations didn't die so much as they moved, abandoning cities that could no longer support them, and presumably dispersing into rural areas where smaller-scale agriculture might sustain survival. This suggests the collapse was primarily economic and political, rather than demographic, with the same people continuing to exist but no longer organized into complex urban societies. The southern Mesopotamian heartland experienced less dramatic collapse than the northern regions, probably due to more reliable water supplies from the Tigris and Euphrates, compared to rain-fed agriculture further north. Cities including Uruk and Lagash show continuity of occupation, though at reduced scale and complexity. This regional variation indicates environmental stress affected different areas differently, with rainfall-dependent agriculture collapsing entirely, while irrigation-based agriculture survived in diminished form. Perhaps 500,000 people lived in Mesopotamia during the Akkadian Empire's peak. Within a century of the collapse, that population may have declined by half or more, though not through mass death but through dispersal, migration, and return to less centralized lifestyles. The urban experiment that had defined Mesopotamian civilization for 1,000 years partially unraveled, surviving in the south while disappearing entirely from northern regions for generations. The ruins remain, low mounds scattered across Iraq and Syria, marking where cities once thrived. Wind continues depositing sediment over them, gradually burying evidence deeper, while simultaneously exposing fragments through erosion, and somewhere beneath that accumulation lies Akkad itself, the cursed capital that divine anger supposedly erased so completely that even its location was forgotten, waiting in patient darkness for the archaeologist, who will finally identify it with certainty and reveal what actually happened when the gods withdrew their protection and let civilization collapse. Sediment cores extracted from the Gulf of Oman in 1993 revealed something that changed how we understand the late 3rd millennium BCE collapse. Geologists examining layers of accumulated material from the seafloor noticed a distinctive change around 2200 BCE in the ratio of calcium carbonate to other minerals, indicating a dramatic shift in wind patterns and dust deposition. The layer showed massive increases in aeolian or wind-blown sediment, suggesting prolonged drought conditions across the entire Near East region. This geological marker became known as the 4.2 kiloyear event, a climate anomaly now recognized as one of the most severe droughts of the Holocene period. Evidence for this drought appears in multiple natural archives including ice cores from Greenland, stalagmite formations in caves across Asia, and lake sediment records from East Africa. The event lasted approximately 300 years, beginning around 2200 BCE and persisting until roughly 1900 BCE, with particularly severe conditions during the initial century. Cave formations in Israel's Sorek cave preserve this climate history with remarkable precision. Stalagmites grow through mineral deposition from water dripping through limestone, with annual layers like tree rings recording environmental conditions. Analysis of oxygen isotope ratios in stalagmite layers dating to 2200 BCE shows an abrupt shift toward values, indicating reduced rainfall, suggesting precipitation declined by 30 to 40% compared to earlier periods. This wasn't a single bad year, but sustained drought lasting generations. The mechanisms driving this climate anomaly remain debated among paleoclimatologists. Some evidence points to volcanic eruptions disrupting atmospheric circulation, with ash particles reflecting sunlight and cooling global temperatures enough to shift monsoon patterns. Other research suggests natural variability in ocean currents or atmospheric pressure systems caused the drought without requiring volcanic forcing. Whatever the ultimate cause, the effects across the Near East were catastrophic for agricultural societies dependent on predictable water supplies. Pollen records from ancient lake beds document how landscapes transformed under drought conditions. Samples from Lake Van in eastern Turkey show dramatic decreases in tree pollen around 2200 BCE, replaced by drought-resistant shrubs and grasses characteristic of semi-arid steppe. Similar changes appear in pollen cores from the Dead Sea region, from northern Mesopotamia, and from the Zagros Mountains. The archaeological landscape where civilizations had flourished became inhospitable to intensive agriculture, forcing populations to abandon cities or suffer famine. Agricultural yields in rain-fed northern Mesopotamia probably declined by 70 to 80% during the worst drought years. Barley, the staple crop, requires approximately 200 millimeters of rainfall annually for viable cultivation. When precipitation dropped below this threshold, crops failed entirely regardless of farming skill or effort. Even southern Mesopotamian irrigation agriculture suffered as river flows decreased, groundwater tables dropped, and soil salinization accelerated when insufficient water flushed accumulated salts from fields. The Akkadian Empire's expansion had pushed agricultural production to its limits during the decades before the collapse. To support imperial administration, military campaigns, and monumental construction, food surpluses needed to increase continuously. New lands were brought under cultivation, irrigation systems extended beyond optimal ranges, and populations concentrated in cities that demanded constant provisioning. This system functioned when environmental conditions remained favorable, but became catastrophically vulnerable when drought struck. Evidence suggests the Akkadians recognized the environmental crisis and attempted responses. Texts from the late Akkadian period mention constructing new canals and repairing old ones, desperate attempts to maintain water supplies as rainfall declined. Royal inscriptions describe grain distribution programs, efforts to prevent famine through administrative intervention, but these measures proved insufficient against drought lasting decades, exhausting reserves and undermining the economic foundation supporting urban civilization. The Gutian invasions described in texts like the Curse of Akkad probably resulted from the same climate crisis. Populations in the Zagros Mountains, dependent on even more marginal agriculture than the Mesopotamian plain, faced starvation when rainfall failed. Migration became survival strategy, with mountain peoples moving into lowland regions seeking food and water. What Sumerian texts describe as barbarian invasion was likely climate refugees fleeing environmental catastrophe in their own territories. This interpretation doesn't make the invasion less violent or destructive from the Mesopotamian perspective, but it contextualizes the violence within environmental constraints, affecting everyone simultaneously. The Gutians weren't invading from strength but from desperation, and the weakened Akkadian Empire couldn't mount effective defense, because drought had already undermined its economic and military capacity. Other civilizations collapsed during this same period through similar processes. Egypt's Old Kingdom ended around 2200 BCE with the First Intermediate Period, a time of political fragmentation, social disruption, and documented famine. The Indus Valley civilization experienced major transformation around 1900 BCE, with many cities abandoned as populations shifted eastward toward more reliable water sources. The synchronicity across such vast regions points towards shared environmental causes rather than independent political or social failures. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of this climate catastrophe is that ancient Mesopotamians had no framework for understanding it as natural climate variability. They experienced drought not as meteorological phenomenon, but as divine punishment, the gods withdrawing rain because humanity had offended them somehow. Every failed harvest reinforced the belief that cosmic order had been disrupted, that the gods had abandoned their earthly dwellings, that civilization was ending because divine protection had been removed. Modern science allows us to see the 4.2 kiloyear event as climate system behavior, explainable through atmospheric dynamics, ocean-atmosphere interactions, and solar radiation variations. But standing in Akkad around 2180 BCE, watching crops wither for the third consecutive year, watching grain stores dwindle, watching children starve while priests made offerings to gods who didn't respond, the theological explanation seemed not just plausible, but obvious. The gods had abandoned them, and the result was catastrophe. The stars continued their movements unchanged, following patterns established long before humans developed agriculture or cities, patterns that would continue long after the civilizations built on agricultural surplus collapsed and reformed, and collapsed again. Climate cares nothing for human suffering, operates according to physical laws indifferent to divine favor or human prayer, and sometimes simply shifts in ways that make previously sustainable societies suddenly unviable. Whether we call it divine abandonment or climate change, the experience of collapse remains identical. The world you depended on no longer functions, the systems that sustained life no longer operate, and survival requires adaptation or migration, or simply endurance through catastrophe, while hoping for conditions to improve. Divine counsels appear repeatedly in Mesopotamian texts as the mechanism through which cosmic decisions get made. The gods don't act individually or arbitrarily, but gather in assembly, debate options, vote on courses of action, and collectively determine fate. This theological framework mirrors earthly political structures where city elders convened to resolve disputes, suggesting Mesopotamians imagined divine governance functioning through similar procedures, requiring consensus among powerful beings. The Curse of Ar-Kadad describes such a council convened to address Naram Sin's sacrilege against the Ekur. Enlil, as king of gods, presides over the assembly. The other great gods attend: Anu the sky god, Enki the wisdom god, Ninurta the warrior god, and various others whose names and functions fill out the divine bureaucracy. These aren't equals exactly, but each possesses authority within their domain and deserves consultation when decisions affect cosmic order. Enlil presents the situation. Naram Sin has violated the most sacred temple in Mesopotamia, profaning what should remain inviolate, disturbing foundations that connect earth to heaven. The offense demands response, but what form should that response take? Strike down the guilty king, punish his entire city, allow human civilization to continue functioning, or withdraw divine protection entirely and let consequences unfold? The Anunnaki serve as witnesses and judges in this assembly. Texts position them not as primary decision-makers, but as divine nobility who observe proceedings, offer counsel when appropriate, and ratify decisions through their collective approval. They number 50 according to some lists, 7 according to others, forming a council of lesser gods subordinate to the great gods, but possessing genuine authority within the cosmic hierarchy. Imagine the debate unfolding across days or weeks of divine time, which might correspond to human years, or might operate according to different scales entirely. Some gods argue for limited punishment, perhaps striking Naram Sin with illness, or allowing his military campaigns to fail, teaching a lesson without destroying civilization. Others advocate for more severe measures, pointing out that limited punishments haven't prevented human arrogance, that each generation of rulers grows more presumptuous, and that fundamental reset might be necessary to restore proper divine-human relationships. Enki typically appears in texts as humanity's advocate, the god who subverts harsher decisions by other deities to preserve human life and knowledge. One can speculate. He argued for mercy during this council, warning that destroying Akkad would cause widespread suffering, affecting innocent populations alongside guilty rulers. But if he did argue this position, he lost the debate. The texts are clear about the final decision: Akkad must be destroyed, divine protection withdrawn, and catastrophe allowed to unfold. The mechanism chosen reveals something important about Mesopotamian theodicy. The gods don't directly annihilate Akkad through supernatural violence, no fire from heaven or earthquake swallowing cities. Instead, Enlil summons the Gutians from the mountains, using human agents to execute divine judgment. This preserves human agency, while positioning disaster as divinely ordained, allowing the gods to punish without overtly violating the natural order they're supposed to maintain. Once the decision is made, systematic abandonment begins. The text lists each major god departing their earthly dwelling, a litany of withdrawal that emphasizes the comprehensiveness of divine rejection. Inanna leaves Akkad, Nanna abandons Ur, Ninurta departs Nippur. Each departure removes protection from that city, exposing populations to forces they previously remained shielded from through divine presence. What does it mean for a god to abandon their dwelling? Theologically, the divine essence that animated the cult statue withdraws, leaving behind empty stone and precious metals but no actual presence. The daily rituals continue, priests still wash and feed and clothe the statue, but something essential has departed. Prayers receive no answers, divination produces only negative omens, and the sense of protection that defined the divine-human relationship vanishes. This theological narrative served multiple functions for ancient Mesopotamians. It explained catastrophic collapse without requiring them to abandon belief in their gods. The gods remained powerful and real, but had chosen to withdraw. It provided moral framework, positioning disaster as punishment for specific transgressions, suggesting that proper behavior might prevent future catastrophes, and it maintained cosmic order even through chaos by showing the gods still controlled events, still operated according to justice, still maintained sovereignty over creation. Modern readers might interpret these texts as sophisticated theodicy, grappling with the problem of suffering. How can gods be both powerful and good when terrible things happen? The Mesopotamian solution positions gods as just but not necessarily merciful, powerful but not obligated to exercise that power on humanity's behalf, and willing to let civilizations collapse when cosmic order requires such correction. Alternative interpretations read these council scenes more literally, suggesting they preserve memories of actual deliberations among beings who governed Earth for their own purposes. In this view, the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial administrators who decided humanity's experiment had failed or become troublesome, and they chose to withdraw rather than continue expending resources, maintaining human civilization. The texts would then document actual departure, real abandonment, genuine loss of protection previously provided by advanced beings. The texts themselves remain ambiguous enough to support multiple readings, which might be intentional. Ancient scribes preserving these narratives across centuries perhaps recognized their own uncertainty about what the stories meant, whether they described theological allegory or distorted historical memory. They copied the words faithfully, let the debates continue, and trusted that the core truth, gods had abandoned humanity during the collapse, transcended questions about literal versus metaphorical interpretation. The stars witnessed these divine councils if they occurred, just as they witnessed the human councils convened in temple courtyards and palace chambers to address the same crisis from terrestrial perspectives. Those stars continue their movements unchanged, marking time according to patterns established before gods supposedly descended to Earth, and will continue long after the last debate about their reality or unreality finally concludes. The Sumerian king list treats the Gutian period with unusual contempt. After listing the kings of Akkad, including Naram-Sin and his successors, the text transitions to the Gutians with the phrase, "Who was king? Who was not king?" This rhetorical question implies chaos, the breakdown of legitimate kingship, a period when proper order collapsed into something barely recognizable as civilization. The list then names 21 Gutian rulers with brief reigns, suggesting rapid turnover and political instability. Texts describe the Gutians as coming from the Zagros Mountains, the rugged range separating the Mesopotamian plain from the Iranian plateau. These were pastoralist or semi-nomadic peoples who practiced mixed farming and herding in mountain valleys, periodically raiding lowland settlements during times of resource stress. Under normal conditions, Mesopotamian military forces deterred such raids, or pursued raiders back into the mountains. But around 2200 BCE, normal conditions ceased. Archaeological evidence shows destruction layers at multiple sites dating to this period. Tel Asmar in the Diyala region has burned buildings and collapsed walls showing clear signs of violent assault. The destruction extends across the entire site, suggesting systematic rather than localized damage. Similar patterns appear at Tel Agrab, Kafaja, and other cities in the Akkadian heartland northeast of Babylon. The invasion succeeded partly because Akkadian military capacity had already deteriorated through environmental and economic stress. Armies require provisioning, soldiers need feeding, Campaigns demand resources that drought-stricken territories couldn't supply. When Gutian forces descended from the mountains, they encountered weakened defenses, depleted garrisons, and populations already struggling with famine, making organized resistance difficult. Imagine standing in the city of Eshnuna, around 2190 BCE, as reports arrive of Gutian forces approaching from the northeast. You're a temple administrator named Ninmar, responsible for managing grain stores that have dwindled alarmingly over 3 consecutive failed harvests. The city council convenes in the temple courtyard at dawn, roughly 50 men including the NC or governor, military commanders, senior priests and guild representatives. Scouts report Gutian warbands numbering perhaps 200 to 300 warriors moving down the Diala River Valley, burning smaller villages and taking livestock. The defensive wall, hastily reinforced 2 years earlier, rises 6 meters high with guard towers every 80 meters, but the garrison numbers only 150 men, many weakened by insufficient rations. The council debates whether to defend, to negotiate, or to evacuate the population southward, toward larger cities that might offer better protection. Ninmar argues for evacuation, pointing out that grain stores contain barely enough to feed the current population for 2 months and couldn't sustain a prolonged siege. Others insist the gods will protect the city if proper rituals are performed. The debate continues through the morning until smoke appears on the horizon, indicating the Gutians have reached the outlying fields. The decision effectively makes itself: those who can flee do so, carrying what portable wealth they possess. Those who remain prepare for assault that arrives at sunset 3 days later. The city fell after brief resistance, its walls breached through a gate left inadequately defended when guards deserted their posts. Archaeological layers show burning throughout the administrative quarter and residential areas, with artifacts left scattered suggesting hasty abandonment rather than orderly evacuation. But calling this simply invasion misses the complexity of what occurred. The Gutians weren't organized state actors pursuing imperial conquest, but rather desperate populations fleeing their own environmental catastrophe in the mountains. Drought affected highland regions even more severely than lowlands, destroying the marginal agriculture that sustained mountain communities. Migration became survival strategy, with lowland wealth representing not greed but necessity. Texts portray them as barbarians, yet this probably reflects ethnic prejudice and trauma rather than accurate ethnography. The Gutians possessed their own cultural practices, governed themselves according to their own systems, and simply operated outside Mesopotamian urban civilization's norms. To Sumerian scribes writing after the collapse, they represented chaos, the forces of disorder that divine withdrawal allowed to sweep across the civilized world. The Gutian period lasted approximately 100 years according to the king list, though chronology remains uncertain, and some scholars suggest shorter duration. During this time, southern Mesopotamian cities maintained some autonomy, continuing to function though at reduced scale and complexity. Northern regions experienced more severe disruption, with many sites abandoned entirely for centuries. Political fragmentation characterized the era. No single power controlled extensive territory. Local rulers operated independently. Trade networks remained disrupted, and the artistic and literary culture that flourished under Akkadian patronage largely ceased. Clay tablets from this period show different handwriting styles and scribal traditions, suggesting breakdown of standardized education systems that previously trained scribes according to uniform methods. Yet life continued. People farmed smaller plots using simplified irrigation, herded animals, made pottery and tools, raised children, and maintained communities, even without imperial administration. The collapse wasn't apocalyptic extinction, but rather transformation from complex urban civilization to simpler settlement patterns that required less centralized coordination and proved more resilient under environmental stress. Perhaps the Gutians served the function the texts claim, instruments through which divine judgment operated, forces of chaos unleashed when gods withdrew protection. Or perhaps they were simply hungry people, seeking survival during climate catastrophe, arriving in Mesopotamia at precisely the moment when weakened defenses couldn't repel them. The result was identical regardless of interpretation. The Akkadian Empire dissolved, cities burned or emptied, and the confident assumption that gods would always protect their civilizations proved tragically mistaken. Empty chambers create peculiar acoustics. The inner sanctuary of a temple, designed to house a divine statue, and the priests who tended it, produces subtle echoes when voices enter spaces meant for silence. Standing in such a chamber around 2150 BCE, after the gods had withdrawn, a priest making daily offerings would hear his own words reflected back, a conversation with absence that emphasized the fundamental change that had occurred. The Lament for Ur describes this experience with devastating precision. Composed after Ur's destruction around 2000 BCE, the text applies equally to the earlier Akkadian collapse, capturing the theological and emotional crisis of divine abandonment. My city, like an innocent ewe, your lamb has been removed. Like an innocent ewe, your lamb has been torn from your embrace, the goddess Ningal mourns, describing her inability or unwillingness to protect her city from destruction. The daily rituals continued despite divine absence. Temple employment records show that priests maintained their schedules throughout the collapse period, performing the same ceremonies their predecessors had conducted for centuries. The statues still required washing each morning, clothing in fresh garments, feeding with elaborate meals featuring bread, beer, meat and fruit. Musicians still played, singers still chanted hymns, and incense still burned in quantities that consumed tons of aromatic resins annually. But something essential had changed. The rituals functioned mechanically, motions performed without the sense of reciprocal relationship that previously gave them meaning. When priests consulted divination, they received only negative omens or no coherent answers at all. When kings sought divine approval for campaigns or construction projects, the gods remained silent. The transactional compact, humans serve, gods protect, had broken down, leaving one party fulfilling obligations while the other had withdrawn. Imagine the psychological impact of this breakdown. The entire worldview of Mesopotamian civilization positioned divine presence as fundamental reality. Gods weren't abstract concepts, but tangible beings residing in specific locations, accessible through proper procedures, responsive to correct ritual performance. When that presence vanished, when the statues stood empty and prayers went unanswered, the foundation of cosmic order seemed to dissolve. Religious trauma on this scale has few historical parallels. Individual faiths have collapsed when prophecies failed, or when conquering religions displaced older traditions. But the Mesopotamian experience involved the simultaneous abandonment of multiple deities across dozens of cities. This wasn't one god failing to protect one community, but the entire divine assembly withdrawing protection from human civilization, creating system-wide religious crisis. The lament texts preserve this trauma in literary form. The lament for Sumer and the lament for Nippur, the lament for Eridu, and others catalogue the devastation city by city, deity by deity, creating a liturgy of loss that was performed during temple rituals for centuries after the collapse. These weren't historical documents so much as theological processing of catastrophe, repeated recitation that allowed communities to acknowledge suffering while maintaining hope for eventual divine return. Archaeological evidence from temple complexes shows declining maintenance during the collapse period. At Nippur, the Ekur complex that served as Enlil's primary residence shows reduced building activity after 2200 BCE, with repairs becoming less frequent and architectural ambitions diminishing. Storage rooms contain fewer exotic imports, suggesting trade networks that supplied temples with precious materials had disrupted. The institutions remained functional, but operated in significantly reduced capacity. Some temples were physically abandoned. At sites across northern Mesopotamia, excavations reveal temple buildings left empty with cultic equipment still in place, suggesting populations fled or died, rather than systematically closing religious installations. These empty temples became targets for looters or squatters, with later occupation layers showing secular use of formerly sacred spaces, a desecration that would have been unthinkable during periods when divine presence made such violations too dangerous to attempt. The collapse of temple economies affected everyone, not just priests. These institutions employed thousands directly and supported countless more through their economic activities. When temple resources dwindled, when agricultural lands went untended and trade goods stopped arriving, the entire population suffered. Ration lists from the late Akkadian period show reduced allotments of barley and oil compared to earlier distributions, indicating systematic impoverishment affecting even those still nominally employed by religious institutions. Perhaps most haunting are texts describing attempts to call the gods back. Prayer rituals specifically designed to address divine anger, elaborate sacrifices exceeding normal offerings, promises of improved behavior and enhanced worship, all appear in administrative records from the collapse period. Communities tried everything they could imagine to restore the relationship, to demonstrate their worthiness for continued protection, to convince the gods that humanity deserved another chance. The gods didn't respond. Or if they did, their response was continued silence, continued absence, continued exposure of human populations to forces they couldn't withstand without divine protection. Whether this was punishment, abandonment, or simply divine choice to withdraw from direct involvement in human affairs, the result was catastrophic for civilizations built on the assumption that gods would always be present. Modern religious consciousness struggles to grasp what this meant. We're accustomed to abstract spirituality, personal faith independent of visible divine presence, religions that emphasize belief over tangible contact with sacred powers. But Mesopotamian religion wasn't primarily about belief, it was about relationship, transaction, daily interaction with gods physically present in their temples. When that presence withdrew, the entire religious system collapsed along with the civilization it supported. The stars continued their movements, Venus rising and setting in her eternal cycle, the moon measuring months through predictable phases, constellations wheeling overhead marking seasons and years. If gods once controlled these celestial mechanisms, they continued functioning flawlessly despite divine withdrawal. If astronomical phenomena simply followed natural law, they demonstrated a reliability and constancy that the gods apparently lacked. Either way, the heavens remained, while the earthly order, supposedly maintained by divine will, dissolved into chaos. Recovery began slowly, tentatively, in scattered locations where local rulers attempted to restore order amid the chaos. Gudea, who governed Lagash from approximately 2144 to 2124 BCE, represents the most successful of these early restoration efforts, a figure whose reign produced remarkable artistic and architectural achievements, despite occurring during the broader collapse period, when most of Mesopotamia remained fragmented and impoverished. 27 statues of Gudea survive, carved from black diorite stone imported from Magan, probably modern Oman, indicating trade networks had partially recovered by his reign. These statues, ranging from 46 to 150 centimeters in height, show Gudea in humble posture, with hands clasped in prayer or holding architectural plans, emphasizing piety rather than military prowess. The inscriptions carved into the statues describe his extensive temple construction projects and his claims of receiving divine guidance through dreams. The most elaborate statue shows him seated with a tablet on his lap containing the ground plan of a temple, architectural specifications visible in carved detail. This image embodies Gudea's primary strategy for restoration: rebuild the temples, demonstrate proper devotion, and perhaps the gods will return to their earthly dwellings. If divine abandonment caused the collapse, then maybe divine return could be secured through monumental piety exceeding anything previous generations had achieved. His major accomplishment was constructing the Aninu temple complex dedicated to Ningirsu, the patron god of Lagash. The building process gets described in 2 lengthy hymns, totaling approximately 1,400 lines, documents that provide extraordinary detail about temple architecture, construction methods, and the theological significance of different architectural elements. The texts describe foundations dug 7 cubits deep, roughly 3.5 meters, to reach virgin soil untouched by previous construction. Cedar beams came from Lebanon, gold and silver from mines in Anatolia or Iran, and precious stones from various distant sources. The hymns portray Ningirsu as actively participating in the design through dream visions. Gudea reports seeing the god in dreams, receiving architectural instructions, learning which materials to use and how to arrange sacred spaces. Whether these dreams represented genuine religious experiences, sophisticated propaganda justifying his building projects, or traditional literary conventions for describing divine approval, remains uncertain. But the texts emphasize that restoration required divine cooperation. Humans couldn't simply rebuild and expect the gods to return. The gods had to want to return, had to approve the plans, had to find the new temples worthy of their presence. Imagine the construction site around 2130 BC. Hundreds of workers excavate foundations, haul stones, shape bricks, and position timbers under the supervision of master craftsmen, whose knowledge spans generations of temple architecture. The labor force includes temple dependents receiving rations, conscripted workers fulfilling service obligations, and probably slaves captured in military campaigns. The site operates year-round except during flood seasons, with work organized into specialized teams handling different materials and construction phases. The air would have smelled of fresh brick dust, cut stone, and cedar resin from imported timbers. Sound would have filled the space, stone hammers striking chisels, overseers calling instructions, work songs coordinating group efforts like lifting heavy beams or moving massive foundation stones. At sunset, fires would have illuminated the site as night shifts continued work on projects that couldn't be interrupted, maintaining continuous progress toward completion. When Gudea finally dedicated the Aninu, elaborate ceremonies marked the temple's opening. The hymns describe processions carrying the divine statue to its new dwelling, rituals establishing cosmic order, and offerings presented on a scale suggesting enormous expenditure of accumulated resources. The ceremony affirmed that Ningirsu had accepted the temple and resumed residence in Lagash, ending decades of divine absence from that city at least. But Gudea's success remained localized. Lagash recovered while surrounding regions continued experiencing collapse effects. The Gudeans still controlled much of northern Mesopotamia, Other city-states remained weakened or abandoned, and the broader Mesopotamian world showed no signs of systematic restoration. Gudea created an island of stability and prosperity in a sea of ongoing disruption, impressive but limited. His statues and inscriptions reveal anxiety beneath the triumphant rhetoric. He repeatedly emphasizes his humility, his careful performance of rituals, his dedication to divine service. This suggests uncertainty about whether his efforts would succeed, whether the gods would truly return, whether building beautiful temples was sufficient to restore the relationship that collapse had broken. He couldn't simply command divine presence. He could only petition, hope, and demonstrate through actions his worthiness to receive divine favor. Archaeological evidence suggests his building claims were largely accurate. Excavations at Lagash have uncovered monumental architecture dating to his reign, showing construction quality and scale that required enormous resources and sophisticated engineering. The investment in religious architecture during such unstable times represents remarkable faith or perhaps desperation, the belief that only through monumental piety could civilization be restored. Gudea's reign ended around 2124 BCE, and subsequent rulers of Lagash achieved less. The dynasty he founded couldn't sustain the prosperity he'd created, suggesting his success depended partly on his personal capabilities rather than systematic restoration of underlying structures. But his attempt demonstrated that recovery was possible, that dedicated rulers could rebuild temples and restore divine relationships, even in the aftermath of catastrophic collapse. The third dynasty of Ur, established around 2112 BCE by Ur-Nammu, eventually achieved broader restoration across southern Mesopotamia, but that restoration built on foundations laid by figures like Gudea, who demonstrated that gods could be called back to their earthly dwellings through proper devotion, that temples could be rebuilt from ruins, and that civilization could recover from even seemingly terminal collapse if humans proved willing to invest extraordinary effort in restoration. The night sky Gudea observed while planning his temples showed the same stellar patterns that had wheeled overhead during the collapse, during the Akkadian Empire's height, and during the earliest Sumerian cities' emergence. Those patterns continued unchanging, marking cosmic time through celestial movements that neither gods nor humans could influence. Witnessing human struggles to make sense of forces beyond control, the heavens held meaning beyond simple timekeeping. For Mesopotamian astronomers, celestial events represented divine communication, with eclipses, planetary conjunctions, and unusual phenomena interpreted as omens, requiring careful documentation and priestly interpretation. Tablet series like Enuma Anu Enlil, compiled over centuries, recorded thousands of astronomical observations paired with their supposed earthly consequences, creating a systematic astrology that guided royal decisions and temple rituals. Around 2200 BCE, several celestial events coincided with the collapse period. Astronomical reconstructions show that a series of lunar eclipses occurred during critical years, visible from Mesopotamia, and following patterns that omen literature treated as particularly ominous. 3 consecutive lunar eclipses within 18 months appeared in 2201, 2200, and 2199 BCE, according to modern calculations, each lasting more than an hour and achieving totality, meaning the moon darkened completely rather than experiencing partial shadow. Lunar eclipses threatened the king specifically, according to Mesopotamian belief. The moon represented the god Nana, or Sin, whose well-being directly affected royal fortunes. When the moon darkened, it signaled divine displeasure or cosmic disorder, requiring immediate ritual intervention. Substitute king ceremonies, where a commoner temporarily assumed royal identity to absorb predicted harm, were performed specifically in response to eclipse omens. But if eclipses continued despite protective rituals, this suggested the gods had stopped accepting human attempts at mitigation. Venus observations may have contributed to perceptions of divine withdrawal. The planet's movements follow an 8-year cycle repeating with slight variations, and disruptions to expected patterns, whether from observational error, atmospheric conditions obscuring visibility, or genuine anomalies, would have been interpreted as the goddess Inanna behaving unpredictably. Given Inanna's association with both love and warfare, her celestial irregularity might have signaled impending violence or social disruption. Some researchers have proposed that cometary appearances or meteor impacts occurred during this period, though evidence remains speculative. Ancient texts occasionally describe stars falling from heaven or unusual lights in the sky, descriptions that could reference meteors, comets, or possibly atmospheric phenomena like aurora displays. If a particularly dramatic celestial event coincided with the collapse's onset, it would have reinforced the belief that cosmic order was breaking down, that the gods were signaling their withdrawal through celestial disruption. The 4.2 kiloyear climate event itself may have had astronomical components, Some paleoclimatologists suggest volcanic eruptions contributed to the drought, and major eruptions often produce spectacular atmospheric effects, visible at great distances, including colored sunsets, halos around the sun and moon, and persistent dust veils that dim sunlight. If Mesopotamian astronomers witnessed such phenomena during the critical years, they would have interpreted them as visible evidence of divine anger, the gods literally darkening the heavens as prelude to withdrawing their protection. Hidden within the astronomical texts lies a deeper question about causation. Did celestial events cause the gods to withdraw, or did divine withdrawal cause celestial disruptions? Mesopotamian cosmology treated these as inseparable, gods-controlled celestial mechanisms, moving planets and stars according to their will. When cosmic order functioned properly, celestial bodies followed predictable paths. When divine society experienced conflict, or when gods chose to punish humanity, the heavens reflected that disorder through eclipses, planetary anomalies, or unusual phenomena. Modern astronomy allows us to calculate that the eclipses occurred according to natural orbital mechanics requiring no divine intervention. The Venus patterns followed gravitational dynamics unchanged for billions of years. Any comets or meteors that appeared represented rocks and ice moving through space according to physical law. But standing beneath those darkened moons or watching Venus disappear from view at unexpected times, Mesopotamian astronomers experienced these events as communications from beings who governed reality. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the astronomical record is its precision combined with complete misinterpretation of mechanism. Mesopotamian astronomers could predict lunar eclipses with reasonable accuracy by the late 3rd millennium BCE, tracking the 18.6-year Saros cycle that governs eclipse patterns. They understood the mathematical relationships between celestial movements well enough to create calendars accurate within days over multi-year periods, yet they remained convinced these movements resulted from divine will rather than physical law. This combination of observational sophistication and theological interpretation raises questions about what ancient astronomers actually believed. Did they understand they were tracking natural patterns but maintained divine explanations for cultural or political reasons? Or did they genuinely experience celestial mechanics as divine agency, unable to conceive of an impersonal cosmos operating without conscious control? The texts themselves remain silent on this question, presenting astronomical observations and divine interpretations as inseparable aspects of the same phenomenon. Alternative researchers have suggested that ancient astronomical knowledge exceeded what we typically attribute to Bronze Age cultures, pointing to the precision of observations and mathematical sophistication of calculations as evidence of either lost advanced human civilizations or extraterrestrial instruction. In this view, the Anunnaki represented beings with genuine astronomical knowledge who taught humanity to track celestial patterns, and their departure around 2200 BCE corresponded with loss of that teaching, forcing humans to maintain observations through tradition while forgetting the deeper understanding that originally generated the knowledge. Mainstream scholarship treats this as unnecessary complication of straightforward human achievement. Mesopotamian astronomers accumulated knowledge through centuries of patient observation, passing techniques across generations, refining methods through trial and error. Their success demonstrates human capability, rather than requiring external assistance. The gods, in this view, were theological constructs that ancient people used to organize their understanding, not literal beings who taught astronomy. The stars themselves remain neutral witnesses to these debates, continuing their movements according to patterns established billions of years ago when stellar systems formed from collapsing gas clouds. Whether those patterns reflect divine will or natural law, whether ancient astronomers learned to track them through human ingenuity or divine instruction, the patterns themselves persist unchanged. Venus still rises as morning and evening star, lunar eclipses still darken the moon every 18.6 years, and the celestial sphere continues rotating as it always has, offering the same view to modern observers that Mesopotamian priests witnessed from their ziggurat summits when gods supposedly still dwelt in earthly temples. Something fundamental changed in how Mesopotamians conceived divine presence after the collapse. Earlier texts position gods as physically dwelling in temple statues, literally inhabiting their earthly residences, accessible through proper ritual performed by authorized priests. Later texts increasingly describe gods as distant, residing in remote heavens, occasionally visiting Earth but no longer permanently present in the way early dynastic theology assumed. This theological evolution appears gradually across texts composed between 2000 and 1500 BCE. The Lament for composed shortly after 2000 BCE, describes the goddess Ningal trying unsuccessfully to prevent Ur's destruction, suggesting she remained present during the catastrophe but lacked power to intervene. Later compositions position gods as more removed, observing earthly events from celestial heights, rather than participating directly in human affairs. The concept of divine transcendence, gods existing in realms fundamentally separate from earthly reality, gained prominence during and after the collapse period, where earlier theology emphasized divine immanence, with gods dwelling among humans in accessible locations. Post-collapse thought stressed the gap between human and divine spheres. Prayer increasingly addressed absent gods rather than present ones, asking them to look down from heaven rather than simply attend to offerings placed before their statues. This shift had profound implications for religious practice. If gods no longer dwelt permanently in temples, then the daily feeding rituals served different functions. Rather than literally nourishing divine beings through physical offerings, the rituals became communications sent toward distant recipients who might choose to notice or ignore them. The transactional certainty of earlier religion, proper offerings guarantee divine favor, gave way to more anxious theology, emphasizing divine freedom and human unworthiness. Perhaps this transformation represented theological innovation, responding to empirical reality. The gods manifestly hadn't protected cities during the collapse, despite proper ritual performance. Rather than abandoning belief in divine power, theologians repositioned the gods as intentionally distant, explaining their non-intervention as choice rather than absence or powerlessness. This preserved divine sovereignty, while accounting for suffering that earlier theology struggled to explain. Architectural changes reflected this theological shift. Temple construction after 2000 BCE increasingly emphasized height, creating ziggurat platforms that elevated shrines closer to heaven. The symbolism suggested reaching upward toward gods who now resided above, rather than simply housing gods who dwelled horizontally within accessible chambers. The ziggurat at Ur, built by Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE, exemplified this trend with its 3 terraces rising approximately 30 meters, topped by a small shrine where heaven and earth supposedly met. Hidden within this architectural symbolism lies recognition that something had broken. The confident assumption that gods lived among humans, that divine presence could be reliably accessed through proper procedure, had dissolved during the collapse. Subsequent generations rebuilt temples and restored rituals, but the underlying relationship had fundamentally changed. Gods might return to visit their earthly dwellings, but they no longer resided there permanently, the way earlier theology described. Alternative interpretations read this shift more literally, as documentation of actual departure. If the Anunnaki were physical beings who resided on Earth during earlier periods, their withdrawal around 2200 BCE would appear in texts as precisely this kind of theological transformation. Earlier documents describe gods as present because they were present. Later texts describe gods as distant because they'd left, relocating to wherever they came from originally, ending their direct involvement in human affairs. This reading treats the theological evolution as preserving genuine historical memory, recording in religious language what actually occurred when extraterrestrial beings ended their presence on Earth. The increasing emphasis on divine transcendence documents humanity's adjustment to new reality, where the beings who supposedly created civilization were no longer accessible, forcing humans to continue without direct divine guidance they'd previously relied upon. Mainstream scholarship views this as projecting modern concepts onto ancient material. The gods were always theological constructs rather than physical entities, and shifts in how people conceived them reflect changing human needs and understandings, rather than changes in divine behavior. The move toward transcendence represents theological sophistication, moving from concrete to abstract conceptions of divinity, a natural evolution in religious thought that occurred in many cultures. The debate can't be definitively resolved because the evidence permits multiple interpretations. The texts describe divine withdrawal and theological transformation, but don't specify whether this documents actual departure of physical beings or metaphorical shifts in religious consciousness. Later Mesopotamians themselves may not have known the answer, inheriting traditions about divine abandonment without certainty about their literal truth. What remains clear is that the collapse traumatized Mesopotamian civilization deeply enough to permanently alter how people related to the sacred. The confident piety of early dynastic religion, where gods protected their cities and responded to proper ritual, gave way to more anxious faith acknowledging that divine protection couldn't be guaranteed, that gods might choose to withdraw, that cosmic order wasn't as stable as earlier generations assumed. Standing in a temple around 1800 BCE, centuries after the collapse, a priest performing daily rituals would have understood his actions differently than his predecessors. He still washed and fed divine statues, still burned incense and chanted hymns, but he did so knowing the gods might not respond, that his offerings ascended toward distant recipients who dwelled in heavens rather than temples, that the relationship his great-great-grandparents took for granted had been permanently disrupted. The stars continued their movements unchanged, marking time according to patterns that neither gods nor humans could alter, whether those patterns reflected divine mechanics or natural law, whether gods once walked Earth and departed or never existed except as human imagination. The result was identical: silence from the heavens, absence where presence once seemed certain, and the slow human work of maintaining civilization without the divine protection earlier generations believed guaranteed their survival. The Sumerian king list structures history according to a pattern that suggests cyclical rather than linear time. Kingship descends from heaven, operates through terrestrial rulers for extended periods, then returns to heaven before descending again to a different city. This framework implies cosmic cycles governing the rise and fall of civilizations, with divine powers periodically withdrawing and returning, according to patterns humans might observe but couldn't control. 3 major cycles organize the king list's chronology. The antediluvian period before the flood features impossibly long reigns and divine-like kings ruling when gods and humans supposedly interacted more directly. The post-flood pre-Akkadian period shows gradually decreasing reign lengths as divine and human spheres separated. The Akkadian collapse and subsequent periods introduce a new pattern where kingship moves between cities as gods withdraw from and return to different locations, suggesting instability replaced the earlier assumption of permanent divine residence. Perhaps the ancient compilers of this text understood collapse, not as anomaly, but as natural phase within repeating patterns. Just as seasons cycle through growth and dormancy, just as the moon waxes and wanes, civilizations might rise and fall according to cosmic rhythms, beyond human ability to prevent. The gods withdraw periodically, not as punishment for specific transgressions, but because withdrawal forms necessary phase in cycles that maintain cosmic balance. This interpretation positions the 2200 BCE collapse as one instance of recurring pattern rather than unique catastrophe. Other collapses preceded it. The flood supposedly reset antediluvian civilization, for instance, and others would follow. The Earthred dynasty that restored order after the Gutian period would itself collapse around 2004 BCE, when Amorite invasions and Elamite attacks ended the last native Sumerian dynasty. These weren't unrelated disasters, but manifestations of cyclical pattern. Evidence for cyclical thinking appears in astronomical texts. The Mesopotamians recognized that celestial phenomena repeated on various timescales: daily solar cycles, monthly lunar phases, annual seasonal patterns, the 18.6-year Saros cycle governing eclipses, longer cycles involving planetary conjunctions. If celestial order operated cyclically, perhaps earthly order followed similar patterns, with civilizations experiencing peaks and troughs according to cosmic rhythms, reflected in but not caused by astronomical cycles. Texts sometimes describe the gods as operating according to cosmic law rather than arbitrary will. They gather in council to make decisions, suggesting constraints on divine freedom. They respond to human actions according to established principles rather than whim. This portrayal hints at deeper structure governing even divine behavior, cosmic order that gods maintain but didn't create and can't fundamentally alter. What if the Anunnaki understood themselves as operating within cyclical constraints? The texts might preserve memory of beings who knew their presence on Earth was temporary, that cosmic law required periodic withdrawal, that they would eventually leave regardless of human behavior. The collapse would then represent not punishment, but phase transition, the completion of one cycle and beginning of another where humanity operated more independently. This reading treats divine withdrawal as inevitable, rather than conditional. The gods didn't leave because Naram Sin violated the Eka, or because humanity became too noisy. They left because the cycle demanded their departure, because cosmic order required periodic reset, because their role involved establishing civilization and then withdrawing to see whether humanity could maintain it independently. The theological narratives that frame departure as punishment might represent later interpretation, imposing moral meaning on what was actually natural progression. Alternative researchers exploring cyclical catastrophism point to evidence for periodic disasters affecting Earth on timescales ranging from centuries to millennia. Volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, solar activity variations, and climate shifts occur according to patterns that might appear cyclical from long-term perspective. If ancient peoples recognized these patterns through accumulated observation across many generations, they might have encoded that knowledge in mythological frameworks describing divine actions, while actually preserving empirical observations about recurring catastrophes. The 4.2 kiloyear event itself fits within longer climate patterns. Ice core data reveals that significant climate anomalies occurred roughly every 1,000 to 1,500 years during the Holocene, suggesting natural variability produces periodic severe droughts or temperature shifts. If Mesopotamian astronomers and priests tracked such patterns over millennia, they might have recognized civilization faces recurring environmental stress requiring periodic adaptation or collapse. Hidden within cyclical frameworks lies acceptance of impermanence. If collapse forms natural phase rather than anomalous disaster, then attempting to prevent it entirely becomes futile. The appropriate response shifts from desperate efforts to maintain civilization against all threats toward graceful adaptation when cycles demand transformation. Build during stable periods, preserve essential knowledge during collapses, rebuild when conditions improve, and accept that this pattern repeats endlessly. Modern systems theory recognizes that complex adaptive systems undergo periodic reorganization, cycling through phases of growth, accumulation, collapse, and renewal. Ecological systems demonstrate this pattern, as do economic systems, with collapses serving necessary functions that clear away accumulated rigidities and allow innovation. Perhaps ancient Mesopotamians intuited similar principles, recognizing through observation that civilizations naturally cycled through these phases. The texts themselves remain ambiguous about whether collapse was punishment, natural cycle, or divine choice. Different compositions emphasize different explanations, suggesting ancient authors held varied opinions, or that explanations shifted across time and context. Later scribes copying these texts probably inherited multiple traditions without ability to determine which preserved historical truth and which represented theological interpretation. Standing beneath the night sky that witnessed countless civilizational rises and falls across human history, we face the same uncertainty ancient Mesopotamians confronted. Are catastrophes that end civilization's punishment for human failings, natural phases within cosmic cycles, or deliberate choices by beings who govern reality according to purposes we can't fully comprehend? The question remains unresolved after 4,200 years, because the evidence permits all these readings, and perhaps certainty matters less than recognizing that every civilization eventually faces its ending, and must decide how to respond when divine protection seems withdrawn and familiar structures collapse. The stars continue their ancient patterns, cycling through the same positions they occupied when Sumerian priests first charted their movements, measuring time through rotations that preceded human consciousness, and will continue long after our questions about divine withdrawal and cyclical catastrophe finally cease to concern anyone. Academic consensus positions the late 3rd millennium BCE collapse as convergence of environmental catastrophe, political overreach, and economic instability, with divine abandonment narratives representing sophisticated theological responses to material disaster rather than documentation of literal divine departure. This interpretation treats Mesopotamian texts as products of human consciousness grappling with trauma through available conceptual frameworks, creating mythology that preserved emotional truth, even if not historical fact. The environmental evidence stands as most compelling element in mainstream explanation. Sediment cores, pollen records, cave formations, and archaeological stratigraphy all document severe drought beginning around 2200 BCE and persisting for centuries. This wasn't debatable interpretation but measurable physical reality. Climate shift recorded in multiple independent archives across vast geographic regions. Civilizations dependent on agriculture face existential threat when rainfall declines by 30 to 40%, and Mesopotamian cities had pushed agricultural production to limits that left no buffer against environmental stress. Political factors compounded environmental vulnerability. The Akkadian Empire's expansion required continuous military success to maintain tribute flows supporting imperial administration. When drought reduced agricultural surplus, the economic foundation supporting armies collapsed, leaving frontiers exposed to invasion by peoples suffering the same environmental crisis. The empire had grown too large to sustain under stressed conditions, and fragmentation became inevitable when central authority could no longer provision garrisons or compel loyalty through distributed resources. Scholars emphasize that divine abandonment narratives served essential functions for traumatized populations. When everything you've built collapses despite proper ritual performance, despite correct offerings, despite generations of faithful service to the gods, you face two possible conclusions. Either the gods are powerless, which destroys the entire theological framework, organizing your understanding of reality, or the gods chose to withdraw, which preserves divine sovereignty, while explaining catastrophe through moral framework that suggests proper behavior might prevent future disasters. The second option clearly proved more psychologically sustainable. The curse of Akkad, and similar lament texts position collapse as punishment for specific transgressions, creating narrative that makes suffering comprehensible. Naram Sin violated the Ekor, therefore Enlil withdrew protection, therefore the Gutians invaded and civilization collapsed. This story offers explanation, moral lesson, and implicit hope, that avoiding similar transgressions might prevent repetition. Comparative mythology reveals that cultures worldwide develop similar narratives when experiencing catastrophe. The biblical flood story parallels Mesopotamian accounts, not because both preserve memories of actual global deluge, but because flood disasters occur regularly in river valley civilizations, and survivors process that trauma through theological frameworks, positioning catastrophe as divine judgment. Greek myths describe ages of decline as gods withdraw from direct human contact. Roman literature mourns the departure of Saturn's golden age, and countless other traditions document similar patterns. Perhaps the most telling evidence comes from archaeological continuity. If actual divine beings withdrew in 2200 BCE, we might expect dramatic changes in material culture, lost technologies, or capabilities that suddenly disappeared. Instead, the archaeological record shows gradual decline and recovery, with the same pottery techniques, architectural methods, metallurgical practices, and agricultural technologies continuing throughout the collapse period. What changed was scale and organization, not fundamental human capabilities. The texts themselves contain clues supporting metaphorical rather than literal reading. The Curse of Akkad was composed roughly a century after the events it describes, written by scribes who never experienced the Akkadian Empire firsthand. The composition shows literary sophistication, careful structure, and thematic development characteristic of theological literature rather than historical documentation. It functions as liturgy performed during rituals, processed artistic response to cultural trauma rather than eyewitness account. Modern readers sometimes struggle with the idea that ancient people created sophisticated fiction or used metaphor to convey truth. We tend to assume pre-modern cultures thought concretely, lacking capacity for abstract symbolism, but Mesopotamian literature demonstrates remarkable sophistication, with authors fully capable of using narrative to explore complex ideas about justice, suffering, divine human relationships, and cosmic order. Treating divine abandonment as theological metaphor respects that sophistication rather than dismissing it. We may never know with absolute certainty what the original composers of these texts believed about their literal truth. Did they think gods actually withdrew, or were they consciously crafting metaphorical explanations for disasters they understood had material causes? The question might be unanswerable, because religious consciousness often holds multiple truth levels simultaneously, treating narratives as both literally meaningful and symbolically true, without experiencing contradiction. What seems clear from mainstream scholarly perspective is that the collapse resulted from identifiable material causes operating according to natural processes. Drought occurred due to climate variability. Invasions resulted from population pressures created by that drought, and political collapse followed when imperial structures couldn't adapt to changed conditions. Gods didn't need to withdraw for these processes to unfold, and divine abandonment narratives represent human meaning-making rather than supernatural causation. This interpretation doesn't diminish the text's importance or reduce them to primitive superstition. Rather, it positions them as sophisticated theological literature, exploring profound questions about suffering, justice, and the relationship between human actions and cosmic consequences. The Mesopotamians who composed these narratives were grappling honestly with the hardest questions existence poses, and their answers deserve respect even when we don't interpret them literally. The mystery lies not in what caused the collapse, which environmental science and archaeology have largely explained, but in what these texts reveal about human consciousness when facing catastrophe. How do we make meaning from disaster? How do we preserve hope when everything collapses? How do we maintain belief in cosmic order when that order manifestly fails to protect us? These questions transcend any specific historical moment, and the Mesopotamian responses continue resonating because they address concerns that remain universal across time. Some researchers approach these texts with different assumptions, asking whether ancient scribes might have been attempting to record actual events in the only conceptual vocabulary available to them. If beings from elsewhere established Mesopotamian civilization, taught agriculture and astronomy and writing, and then departed around 2200 BCE, the texts describing divine abandonment would preserve genuine historical memory translated into theological language. Zecharia Sitchin's interpretation of Sumerian texts, though controversial among mainstream scholars, offers internally consistent alternative reading. He argued that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru, following a long elliptical orbit through our solar system. These beings established human civilization for their own purposes, maintained direct presence on Earth for millennia, and eventually withdrew, either because their mission completed, or because conditions changed, making continued presence unnecessary or impossible. In this framework, the Curse of Akkad documents actual departure, The gods abandoning their dwellings describes literal evacuation of beings who'd resided in temple complexes for generations. The Gutian invasion follows naturally as consequence of removed protection, with populations previously deterred by advanced technology or military superiority, suddenly able to sweep across undefended territories. The environmental catastrophe might have been natural disaster that triggered departure, or possibly result of technologies being shut down when the beings left. Alternative researchers point to specificity in abandonment descriptions as evidence for literal interpretation. The texts don't vaguely describe gods becoming distant. They list specific deities leaving specific cities in apparently chronological sequence. Inanna departs Akkad first, then Nana leaves followed by systematic withdrawal of other major gods from their temple residences. This level of detail suggests eyewitness accounts or records based on eyewitness testimony, rather than later literary invention. The question of technology deserves consideration. If the Anunnaki possessed capabilities significantly exceeding Bronze Age human technology, their departure would have appeared as withdrawal of divine power. Advanced communication devices, weapons, transportation systems, or energy sources would seem miraculous to populations lacking scientific frameworks to understand them. When those technologies shut down or were removed, the experience would have matched exactly what the texts describe, gods who once performed wonders becoming silent and absent. Graham Hancock's work exploring potential lost civilizations offers middle ground between mainstream archaeology and ancient astronaut theories. Perhaps advanced human societies existed before the end of the last ice age, achieving sophisticated astronomical knowledge and architectural capabilities. Before being destroyed by cataclysms around 10,000 BC, survivors could have spread across the globe, appearing as culture heroes or gods to less developed peoples, teaching civilization-building skills before eventually dying out, or being absorbed into populations they'd instructed. This hypothesis doesn't require extraterrestrial contact, but does challenge conventional archaeological chronology. The gods who withdrew in 2200 BCE might have been descendants of these earlier advanced humans, maintaining knowledge and technologies inherited from antediluvian civilizations, finally losing their capabilities or choosing to disappear as their distinct identity, eroded through intermarriage and cultural change. Cyclical catastrophism presents another alternative framework. Some researchers propose that Earth experiences periodic cosmic events, perhaps caused by comet impacts, solar activity variations, or encounters with interstellar dust clouds, that trigger environmental catastrophes and disrupt civilizations. If such events occur on roughly 3,000 to 5,000 year cycles, the 2200 BCE collapse would represent one instance of recurring pattern. Ancient peoples might have recognized this pattern through accumulated observation, encoding it in myths about divine withdrawal and return that actually preserve knowledge about recurring catastrophes. We may never achieve certainty about which interpretation preserves truth. The evidence permits multiple readings, each internally consistent within its own assumptions. Mainstream scholarship explains the collapse through material causes without requiring supernatural or extraterrestrial elements. Alternative interpretations treat the text more literally, while facing the burden of providing evidence for extraordinary claims about non-human involvement in human civilization. Perhaps the most honest position acknowledges that ancient consciousness differs fundamentally enough from ours that we can't fully recover what the text meant to those who composed them. They might have believed literal gods withdrew, or they might have understood they were creating sophisticated metaphor, or possibly they held both perspectives simultaneously, in ways our either-or thinking struggles to comprehend. The value of exploring alternative interpretations lies not in definitively proving them, but in maintaining openness to possibilities that challenge our assumptions. Academic consensus has been wrong before, paradigms shift when new evidence emerges, and certainty about ancient matters often proves unwarranted. Approaching these texts with humility means acknowledging that both mainstream and alternative readings might capture partial truth, while missing aspects we can't yet perceive. What remains undeniable is that something profound occurred around 2200 BCE that traumatized Mesopotamian civilization, deeply enough to permanently alter their relationship with the sacred. Whether that something was purely environmental and political, involved departure of non-human beings, or reflected cosmic cycles beyond current scientific understanding, the texts preserve memory of catastrophe that felt like abandonment by powers that had protected humanity. The mystery endures because the evidence doesn't conclusively favor any single interpretation. We can measure the drought in sediment cores, document the destruction in archaeological layers, and trace theological evolution through cuneiform texts. But the question of whether divine beings actually existed and chose to withdraw, or whether traumatized humans created powerful mythology to explain material catastrophe, remains ultimately unanswerable from our position. 4,200 years removed from the events. Maybe that's appropriate. Maybe some questions should remain open, preserving space for wonder and multiple perspectives, preventing premature certainty about matters where certainty might be impossible. The texts invite each generation to encounter them anew, to decide for themselves what divine abandonment means, and to draw whatever lessons seem relevant to their own time's challenges. That openness across millennia represents its own kind of achievement, words flexible enough to speak truth regardless of whether we interpret them literally, metaphorically, or somewhere in the vast ambiguous territory between. The memory survived because they wrote it down. Scribes during the Earth III period, roughly a century after the worst of the collapse, copied and recopied the lament texts that describe divine abandonment, preserving the trauma in permanent form. The Curse of Akkad exists in multiple manuscript versions spanning at least 800 years, indicating it was studied in scribal schools, performed in temple rituals, and transmitted as essential cultural knowledge across generations who never experienced the events it described. This act of preservation represents something profound about human consciousness. The Mesopotamians didn't want to forget the collapse, didn't seek to erase the trauma or move forward unburdened by its memory. They chose instead to ritualize the pain, to make remembering an act of worship, to ensure future generations would know that civilizations can fall and gods can withdraw. The lament text functioned as warning, as explanation, and as comfort. If collapse had happened before, and recovery followed, perhaps recovery would come again when future disasters struck. The text traveled beyond Mesopotamia, through cultural transmission. When Babylon became dominant in the 2nd millennium BCE, Babylonian scribes preserved Sumerian compositions alongside their own Akkadian literature. When Assyria rose in the 1st millennium BCE, Assyrian libraries collected these ancient works, treating them as canonical wisdom deserving study and preservation. King Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, assembled around 650 BCE, contained copies of collapse narratives composed 1,500 years earlier, maintaining memory across vast temporal distances. Then came forgetting. When cuneiform fell out of use around 100 CE, the text became unreadable. The cities dissolved into mounds, the tablets lay buried beneath accumulated sediment, and the stories of divine abandonment vanished from human consciousness, except as dim echoes in biblical and classical sources that no longer remembered their Mesopotamian origins. For 1,700 years, the collapse of 2200 BCE existed only as geological and archaeological traces waiting for rediscovery. Austin Henry Layard's excavations at Nineveh, beginning in 1845, started the recovery. His team shipped thousands of clay tablets to the British Museum, where they sat largely ignored while scholars focused on more visually impressive sculptures and reliefs. The decipherment of cuneiform in the 1850s finally allowed these texts to speak again, and the Curse of Akkad re-emerged into human awareness when scholars translated the first manuscripts in the late 19th century. Even now, new tablets continue surfacing from museum storage, awaiting translation by the small number of specialists qualified to read Sumerian cuneiform. The British Museum holds approximately 130,000 cuneiform tablets, with significant portions still unpublished. Iraqi museums contain thousands more, some excavated decades ago but never fully studied, others discovered in recent years despite the region's political instability. Each new translation potentially adds detail to our understanding of the collapse, revising or confirming what earlier scholarship established. Modern climate science has vindicated aspects of the ancient narratives in unexpected ways. The drought they attributed to divine anger really occurred, documented now through sediment cores and paleoclimate proxies that ancient scribes couldn't have imagined. The environmental catastrophe was real, lasting for centuries just as the texts suggest, severe enough to justify the traumatized responses preserved in lament literature. They weren't inventing disaster to explain theological questions, they were processing actual catastrophe through available conceptual frameworks. Still today, we face similar questions about collapse. Climate change threatens agricultural systems, political polarization weakens international cooperation, and the complex global civilization we've built appears vulnerable in ways that parallel late Akkadian fragility. When we read about divine abandonment and an environmental catastrophe around 2200 BCE, we're not encountering alien concerns from incomprehensible ancient minds. We're reading about people confronting existential threats to their way of life, trying to understand why the systems they depended on were failing, and desperately seeking solutions before complete collapse occurred. The patterns repeat because the underlying dynamics remain constant. Civilizations that push environmental resources to their limits become vulnerable when conditions shift. Political structures that expand beyond sustainable scales fragment when central authority weakens. Populations that assume divine favor or technological progress will always protect them. Discover painfully that neither gods nor tools guarantee survival when fundamental systems break down. The Mesopotamians learned these lessons 4,200 years ago, and their texts preserve knowledge that remains relevant today. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of their legacy is the question they left unanswered. Did proper human behavior cause the gods to return during the Earth 3 restoration, or did environmental conditions simply improve, allowing recovery regardless of ritual performance? The texts celebrate Ur-Nammu and his successors for rebuilding temples and re-establishing divine worship, crediting them with calling the gods back to their earthly dwellings. But modern science shows the drought ended around 1900 BCE through natural climate variability, requiring no supernatural intervention to explain recovery. We inherit both perspectives: the ancient theological framework that attributes collapse and recovery to divine will, and the modern scientific understanding that positions them as natural processes. Neither explanation necessarily excludes the other completely, and perhaps wisdom lies in holding both possibilities while remaining humble about claims to certainty. The Mesopotamians were responding to real environmental catastrophe when they composed their collapse narratives, and their responses preserve genuine insight about human vulnerability and resilience. The story continues in us, because we're still asking their questions. Why do civilizations fall? Can we prevent collapse through proper action, or do cycles beyond our control guarantee periodic catastrophe? When the systems we depend on fail, is it our fault or simply the nature of complex systems that they eventually break down? The answers remain as uncertain today as they were when Sumerian scribes first pressed styluses into wet clay to record how the gods abandoned their dwellings and civilization ended. The stars that witnessed the collapse still wheel overhead, marking time through patterns unchanged across millennia. Venus still rises as morning and evening star, the moon still measures months through its phases, and the celestial sphere continues rotating just as it did when Mesopotamian priests climbed ziggurat stairs, seeking omens in planetary positions. Those priests are gone, their cities dissolved, their gods silent or departed, or perhaps never there at all. But the questions they asked persist, carried forward by each generation that confronts the possibility of collapse and wonders whether divine powers might be withdrawing, whether environmental catastrophe approaches, whether the confident assumption that our civilization will endure might prove as mistaken as the Akkadians' similar confidence proved 200 years ago, when the world they'd built suddenly dissolved into chaos that felt like abandonment by every force they believed protected them. Come back now to where you are. The room around you, quiet and dim, your breathing, slow and natural, the rhythm that's carried you through these hours of exploration, the weight of your body resting against whatever surface holds you, solid and present. The ancient voices we've been listening to have returned to their clay tablets, settled back into museum storage and archaeological archives, back into the patient silence they maintained for millennia before we disturbed them with our questions and translations. The ruins still stand in Iraq, low mounds rising barely a meter above the desert floor where cities once sprawled across irrigated plains. Tel Leilan remains abandoned, its 300-year gap in occupation preserved in sterile sediment layers. Nippur's Ekur has dissolved mostly to foundation stones, the temple where Enlil supposedly dwelt reduced to scattered bricks and eroded walls. Akkad itself has never been found, perhaps fulfilling the curse that it should vanish so completely that even its location would be forgotten. These sites hold memory in their stratified earth, stories pressed into geological layers that patient excavation slowly reveals. We've asked many questions tonight about why civilizations collapse, and whether gods withdraw or simply never existed in the forms ancient people imagined. We've explored climate catastrophe, documented in sediment cores, invasion by desperate refugees fleeing their own environmental crisis, political fragmentation, when empires grew beyond sustainable scales. We've examined texts describing divine abandonment in systematic detail, theological responses to trauma that may preserve literal truth or sophisticated metaphor, or something between those categories. Some mysteries we've illuminated, tracing how the 4.2 kiloyear event devastated Near Eastern civilizations, how Mesopotamian societies responded to catastrophic drought, how memory of collapse shaped religious thought for millennia afterward. Other mysteries remain exactly as mysterious as when we began. Questions about divine presence and cosmic cycles, and whether beings called Anunnaki once walked Earth and then departed, leaving humanity to continue without protection we'd grown to depend upon. Perhaps we're not meant to achieve certainty about what happened when the gods withdrew. The evidence permits multiple interpretations, each capturing partial truth while missing aspects we can't yet perceive or might never access. The text remained, baked clay preserving words from minds separated from us by vast gulfs of time and culture and consciousness. We read them through our own assumptions, find in them our own concerns about collapse and vulnerability, and the question of whether powers greater than ourselves might be watching or have abandoned us to face consequences alone. The stars continue their movements, following paths established billions of years ago when stellar systems formed from collapsing gas clouds. Venus rises as morning star and sets as evening star in her eternal 584-day cycle, the same pattern Mesopotamian astronomers tracked when gods supposedly still dwelt in earthly temples. The moon measures months through phases that Sumerian calendars synchronized with solar years, creating time systems we inherited directly from their patient observations. Those celestial patterns witnessed the rise of Sumerian civilization, the flowering of the Akkadian Empire, the catastrophic collapse around 2200 BCE, the slow recovery under Ur-3 rule, and every subsequent rise and fall across 4 millennia leading to our present moment. If gods once moved those stars according to their will, they continue functioning flawlessly despite divine absence or departure. If celestial mechanics simply follow physical law, they demonstrate reliability and constancy that neither gods nor humans have matched. Either way, the heavens persist unchanged, while earthly order repeatedly builds and collapses and rebuilds again. Civilizations rising from previous ruins, each generation asking whether their world will endure or whether they too will experience the abandonment that earlier peoples recorded in words, still waiting in darkness to speak to whoever comes next, with patience enough to listen. Wind moves across the Iraqi desert, carrying sand and silence, wearing down what little remains of walls that once enclosed millions of lives. Rain falls occasionally, rare but welcome, temporarily transforming dust into brief green growth before heat returns, and desert reasserts itself. The Euphrates still flows, though in altered channels and diminished volume, connecting past to present through simple persistence, water following gravity as it always has, and somewhere beneath that wind and rain and flowing water, beneath accumulated sediment and the weight of deep time, clay tablets wait in patient stillness, their wedge-shaped marks still legible after 4,200 years, still capable of speaking if someone takes the trouble to read them, telling again how the gods abandoned their dwellings and civilization collapsed, and survivors wondered why, and whether proper devotion might call divine protection back. Questions that each generation encounters in their own way, asking again what their ancestors asked, receiving again the same ambiguous answers that satisfy some and leave others searching. The mystery enduring, because perhaps mystery serves essential purposes, keeping us humble before forces we can't control, reminding us that civilizations are fragile and divine favor uncertain, and the only constant is change itself, the eternal rhythm of rise and fall, building and collapse, remembering and forgetting and remembering again, across cycles so vast that even stars participate, witnessing everything from their impossible distances, marking time through movements that neither gods nor humans can influence, continuing their ancient dance, while below them the questions persist in patient silence, waiting,